By the final years of the 4th century BCE, Greece stood at a historical crossroads. Its cities remained the intellectual and cultural center of the Mediterranean world, yet political authority had shifted decisively beyond their control. The death of Alexander III of Macedon in Babylon in 323 BCE did not restore Greek autonomy. Instead, it initiated a prolonged era of instability, as power fractured among competing successors and local institutions struggled to survive within a new imperial framework. Alexander left no clear heir capable of ruling his vast empire. In the immediate aftermath, senior commanders known as the Diadochi divided authority through a series of provisional settlements, beginning with the partition of Babylon. While these agreements addressed imperial administration, they offered no resolution for Greece itself. Macedonian control over the mainland, established during the reigns of Philip II and Alexander, remained intact. Greek polis found themselves subject to distant royal authority without a unified imperial center to restrain internal rivalries. Athens emerged as an early focal point of resistance. In 323 BCE, the city led the Lamian War, a coalition effort aimed at expelling Macedonian garrisons and restoring political independence. Ancient sources, including Diodorus Siculus, record initial successes against Macedonian forces. However, the coalition lacked sustained coordination and adequate resources. By 322 BCE, Antipater decisively defeated the rebels at the Battle of Cranon. The settlement that followed imposed harsh terms on Athens, including the installation of a Macedonian-backed oligarchy and the stationing of a garrison at Munichia. Similar arrangements were enforced elsewhere across Greece. Throughout the late 4th century BCE, Macedonian kings consolidated their hold through military occupation and political supervision. Strategic strongholds known collectively as the fetters of Greece became central instruments of control. These included Corinth, commanding the Isthmus, Chalcis, overseeing the Euripus Strait, and Demetrius, dominating Thessaly. Archaeological remains of fortifications at these sites, along with inscriptions referencing royal officials, confirm their role as permanent mechanisms of oversight rather than temporary garrisons. Traditional city-states retained internal civic institutions, such as councils and magistracies, but their autonomy was increasingly constrained. Decisions involving foreign policy, military organization, and alliances required Macedonian approval. Even Sparta, which had resisted Macedonian domination longer than most Greek states, remained isolated and strategically marginalized after its defeat at Megalopolis in 331 BCE. By the early 3rd century BCE, no major polis possessed the capacity to challenge royal authority independently. The fragmentation of Alexander's empire intensified these conditions. The successor wars repeatedly redirected Macedonian military resources toward Asia and Egypt, leaving Greece politically unstable, but still tightly controlled. Antigonus Monophthalmus and later his son Demetrius Poliorcetes intervened directly in Greek affairs, alternating between policies of liberation and domination depending on strategic necessity. In 307 BCE, Demetrius expelled the Macedonian garrison from Athens and restored democratic institutions, an act commemorated by honorary decrees and statues. Yet this restoration proved temporary, as garrisons soon returned under shifting political circumstances. By the early 3rd century BCE, the Antigonid dynasty established itself as the dominant Macedonian power. Antigonus II Gonatas secured the Macedonian throne following his victory over Gallic invaders around 277 BCE. His reign marked a more stable phase of royal authority, but stability did not translate into Greek independence. Instead, Macedonian kings relied increasingly on indirect rule, manipulating alliances, sponsoring friendly elites, and intervening selectively to suppress unrest. In response to this environment, new political formations emerged within Greece. Federal leagues, most notably the Aetolian and Achaean leagues, expanded during the early 3rd century BCE. These organizations sought collective security through shared assemblies, magistrates, and military forces. Inscriptions from Achaean cities attest to standardized laws and coordinated diplomacy. While leagues offered a degree of protection against local rivals, they remained militarily inferior to Macedon and internally divided over strategy and leadership. The coexistence of royal dominance and fragmented autonomy defined the Greek world between 323 and 280 BCE. Cultural life continued to flourish, as evidenced by philosophical schools, artistic production, and religious festivals. Yet political sovereignty had largely vanished. Greece was no longer a system of independent states, but a contested landscape managed by external powers and internal coalitions operating within narrow constraints. By the end of the 3rd century BCE's opening decades, Greece remained divided, strategically constrained, and structurally vulnerable. These conditions did not produce immediate collapse, but they ensured that future interventions by rising powers would encounter limited coordinated resistance. As competition among Greek states persisted, a new force across the Adriatic began to observe events in the eastern Mediterranean with increasing attention. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and enable notifications to receive future Nightfall history documentaries. If this topic interests you, consider leaving a comment highlighting the section you found most compelling. By the early 3rd century BCE, political organization in Greece no longer centered primarily on individual city-states. In response to prolonged Macedonian dominance and persistent instability, Greek communities increasingly pursued collective security through federal leagues. These organizations represented a significant departure from the classical polis system, reflecting both adaptation to new realities and the limits of Greek political unity in the Hellenistic age. The most prominent of these federations were the Achaean League in the northern Peloponnese and the Aetolian League in central Greece. Both expanded rapidly after 280 BCE, incorporating multiple polis into shared political frameworks. Archaeological evidence, including standardized coinage and federal decrees, indicates a high degree of institutional development. Member cities retained local laws and magistrates but delegated authority over foreign policy, warfare, and diplomacy to federal assemblies and elected strategoi. The Achaean League developed a relatively centralized structure. Polybius, himself an Achaean statesman, provides detailed descriptions of its political mechanisms, including annual elections, popular assemblies, and unified military command. Decisions were formally collective, though influence often rested with larger or wealthier cities such as Corinth and Megalopolis. The League presented itself as a defender of autonomy, particularly against Macedonian interference, yet its effectiveness depended heavily on internal cohesion. The Aetolian League followed a different model. Less centralized and more militarized, it functioned as a loose confederation of communities connected by shared military interests. Aetolian forces were highly mobile and frequently engaged in raiding and mercenary activity. Inscriptions from Delphi record Aetolian control over the sanctuary during the early 3rd century BCE, demonstrating the League's ability to exert regional influence. However, its reputation for opportunism and aggression limited broader Greek support. Despite their organizational sophistication, the Leagues faced persistent internal challenges. Political divisions between democratic and oligarchic factions frequently disrupted decision-making. Polybius records episodes in which personal rivalries and local interests undermined federal unity. Leadership transitions often produced abrupt shifts in foreign policy, particularly regarding relations with Macedon. Alliances were shaped less by ideology than by immediate security concerns. Relations between the leagues themselves further complicated the political landscape. The Achaean and Aetolian leagues competed for territory, influence, and prestige, particularly in central Greece and the Peloponnese. These rivalries prevented the emergence of a unified Greek front capable of resisting external powers. Diplomatic inscriptions from Olympia and Delphi document rapidly changing alliances, with cities frequently switching allegiance in response to local pressures. Macedonian kings exploited these divisions effectively. Antagonid rulers alternated between confrontation and accommodation, supporting certain leagues or cities to counterbalance others. Garrisons were removed or reinstated strategically, reinforcing dependence on royal arbitration. The leagues, while designed to preserve autonomy, often became instruments within larger power struggles rather than independent actors. Military limitations further constrained league effectiveness. Although capable of mobilizing citizen forces, The leagues lacked the resources and professional armies necessary to challenge Macedonian field forces consistently. Their reliance on seasonal levies and limited logistics reduced their capacity for sustained campaigns. This imbalance reinforced a pattern of short-term resistance followed by negotiated settlements. By the mid-3rd century BCE, federal leagues had become the dominant form of Greek political organization. They preserved elements of collective self-governance and offered partial protection against isolation. At the same time, their internal divisions, mutual rivalries, and strategic dependence on external powers ensured that Greece remained politically fragmented. The leagues represented adaptation rather than recovery, operating within constraints imposed by the broader Hellenistic power structure. As these federations competed for survival and influence, their diplomatic choices increasingly entangled them in conflicts beyond Greece itself. This fragmented and competitive environment shaped how Greek states responded when a new power from the Western Mediterranean began to intervene in Eastern affairs. The first direct confrontation between Rome and Macedon emerged not from Greek affairs, but from a wider Mediterranean crisis. By the late 3rd century BCE, Rome was engaged in an existential struggle against Carthage during the Second Punic War. Hannibal's victories in Italy destabilized Roman security, while political attention shifted urgently toward preventing hostile alliances beyond the Italian peninsula. It was within this broader strategic context that Greece entered Rome's sphere of concern. Philip V of Macedon initially maintained a cautious neutrality. However, Rome's naval presence in the Adriatic and its earlier interventions against Illyrian piracy increasingly constrained Macedonian ambitions. In 215 BCE, following Rome's defeat at Cannae, Philip concluded a treaty with Hannibal. The agreement, preserved in fragments by Polybius, outlined a coordinated strategy against Roman interests in the Adriatic. Although its military provisions were limited, the alliance signaled Philip's intent to exploit Roman vulnerability. Roman response was restrained but deliberate. Lacking the resources for a full-scale Eastern war while Hannibal remained active in Italy, Rome pursued a strategy of containment rather than conquest. The Senate authorized naval operations along the Adriatic coast and sought alliances among Greek states hostile to Macedon. Chief among these was the Aetolian League, whose long-standing rivalry with Macedon made cooperation politically feasible. The resulting conflict, conventionally dated from 214 to 205 BCE, remained limited in scope. Roman forces avoided deep penetration into Macedonia, relying instead on naval mobility and local proxies. Operations centered on coastal raids, diplomatic pressure, and support for allied Greek forces. Archaeological surveys across mainland Greece show little evidence of widespread destruction during this period, supporting ancient accounts that describe the war as episodic rather than continuous. The Aetolian League served as Rome's primary land-based partner. In return for Roman naval assistance, the Aetolians conducted campaigns against Macedonian positions in central Greece. These operations, documented in inscriptions and literary sources, produced localized disruptions but failed to secure lasting strategic gains. Internal divisions within the League, combined with limited manpower, constrained sustained offensive action. Philip V responded by consolidating control over key regions rather than seeking decisive engagement with Roman forces. Macedonian campaigns focused on suppressing revolts and neutralizing League allies. The king also pursued diplomacy aggressively, detaching Greek states from the anti-Macedonian coalition through negotiation and selective concessions. This approach reduced the effectiveness of Roman-aligned resistance without escalating the conflict. Throughout the war, neither side committed its full military capacity. Rome remained focused on Italy and Iberia, while Macedon avoided overextension in Greece. Polybius emphasizes the secondary importance of the conflict for both powers, noting that major battles were conspicuously absent. The war functioned more as a test of influence than as a contest for territorial control. By 206 BCE, the strategic environment shifted. Roman victories in the Western Mediterranean reduced the urgency of immediate containment, while Philip faced renewed pressures along his northern borders. Both sides moved toward negotiation. In 205 BCE, representatives met at Phoenix in Epirus to formalize peace. The resulting treaty restored the status quo ante bellum, with no territorial transfers or reparations. Rome formally withdrew its forces from Greece, while Philip renounced claims on certain Adriatic regions. Despite its limited scope, the First Macedonian War carried long-term consequences. Rome had demonstrated the ability to project power into the Greek world through alliances rather than direct occupation. Diplomatic relationships established during the conflict endured beyond the peace settlement. Greek states, particularly federal leagues, now viewed Rome as a potential counterweight to Macedonian dominance. The treaty did not resolve underlying tensions. Macedon remained the dominant power in Greece, while Rome retained strategic interests across the Adriatic. Mutual suspicion persisted, reinforced by the memory of alliance with Hannibal and the precedent of Roman intervention. Although hostilities ceased in 205 BCE, the mechanisms for renewed conflict were already in place. By the early 2nd century BCE, temporary peace masked a fragile balance of power. The First Macedonian War ended without decisive victory, but it marked Rome's permanent entry into Greek affairs, setting the stage for more direct confrontation in the decades that followed. By the opening years of the 2nd century BCE, the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean had shifted decisively. Rome emerged from the Second Punic War militarily dominant and increasingly confident in projecting power beyond Italy. At the same time, Philip V of Macedon sought to exploit the weakening of other Hellenistic kingdoms, particularly in the Aegean world. These parallel developments brought Rome and Macedon into renewed confrontation. Following the Peace of Phoenix in 205 BCE, Philip expanded aggressively in the eastern Aegean and Asia Minor. Ancient sources, including Polybius and Livy, describe Macedonian attacks on cities allied with Pergamon and Rhodes. These actions disrupted established trade routes and alarmed Greek states dependent on maritime commerce. Complaints were brought before the Roman Senate, where diplomatic appeals framed Philip's actions as threats to Greek autonomy and regional stability. Rome initially responded through diplomacy rather than immediate war. Roman envoys demanded that Philip cease hostilities against Greek cities and withdraw from contested territories. Philip's refusal, coupled with continued military operations, convinced Roman leaders that armed intervention was necessary. In 200 BCE, Rome formally declared war, marking the beginning of the Second Macedonian War. Unlike the earlier conflict, Rome now committed significant military resources. Consular armies crossed into Illyria and Thessaly, while Roman fleets operated throughout the Aegean. Crucially, Rome positioned itself as a defender of Greek freedom, a message carefully tailored to appeal to cities wary of Macedonian domination. This diplomatic strategy proved effective. Pergamon and Rhodes provided naval support, while the Achaean League, after internal debate, eventually aligned with Rome in 198 BCE. Greek alliances played a decisive role in shaping the conflict. The Achaean League's defection weakened Macedonian influence in the Peloponnese, while Roman-backed coalitions restricted Philip's ability to maneuver freely. Inscriptions from allied cities record honors granted to Roman commanders, reflecting growing acceptance of Roman leadership. These alliances were pragmatic rather than ideological, driven by immediate security concerns rather than long-term loyalty. Military operations unfolded across central Greece. Early campaigning was inconclusive, marked by difficult terrain and supply challenges. Roman commanders adapted gradually, coordinating infantry advances with allied contingents. Philip relied on the traditional Macedonian phalanx, a formation that had dominated Hellenistic warfare for generations. Its strength lay in cohesion and frontal power, but it required stable ground and precise coordination. The decisive encounter occurred in 197 BCE near the hills of Cynocephaly in Thessaly. According to Polybius, the battle developed unexpectedly, as both armies advanced in poor visibility and uneven terrain. Portions of the Macedonian phalanx engaged before the formation was fully assembled. Roman manipular units operating in smaller, more flexible formations exploited these gaps. Legionaries maneuvered around exposed flanks, attacking where the phalanx could not effectively respond. Archaeological studies of weaponry and battlefield dynamics support ancient accounts of tactical imbalance. The Roman system allowed independent unit action, rapid redeployment, and close combat adaptability. By contrast, the phalanx's rigidity became a liability once formation integrity was compromised. The battle ended in a decisive Macedonian defeat, with heavy casualties and the collapse of Philip's field army. The aftermath of cynocephaly transformed the political landscape of Greece. Philip was forced to abandon territories in Greece, dismantle much of his fleet, and pay indemnities. Macedon remained independent but strategically constrained. Roman commanders, led by Titus Quinctius Flamininus, now held unprecedented influence over Greek affairs. Victory also reinforced Rome's diplomatic narrative. Roman authorities emphasized that the war had been fought to protect Greek freedom rather than to annex territory. This framing was critical in maintaining alliance networks and limiting resistance. Greek states, though increasingly dependent on Roman arbitration, viewed the outcome as preferable to continued Macedonian dominance. By the conclusion of the Second Macedonian War, Rome had demonstrated both military superiority and diplomatic effectiveness. The defeat of the Macedonian phalanx by Roman legions marked a turning point in Hellenistic warfare, while Rome's alliance system reshaped regional power structures. Military success now provided the foundation for political reorganization across Greece, setting the conditions for a new phase of Roman involvement. By the early 190s BCE, Roman influence in Greece had expanded beyond military victory into political arbitration. Following the defeat of Macedon at Cynocephaly, Rome assumed the role of mediator in Greek affairs, settling disputes and enforcing agreements between states. While this arrangement limited Macedonian resurgence, it generated dissatisfaction among Greek factions that viewed Roman oversight as increasingly intrusive. This discontent created an opening for renewed external intervention. The Aetolian League emerged as the most vocal opponent of Roman influence. Dissatisfied with the post-war settlement, Aetolian leaders argued that Rome had merely replaced Macedon as the dominant power. Seeking to counterbalance Roman authority, they invited Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire to intervene in Greece. Antiochus, already engaged in campaigns to reassert control over Asia Minor, viewed the invitation as an opportunity to expand westward and present himself as a liberator of Greek cities. In 192 BCE, Antiochus crossed into Greece with a relatively small force. Ancient sources, including Livy and Polybius, indicate that his expedition relied heavily on Aetolian support and the expectation of broader Greek backing. However, this support failed to materialize. Most Greek states, including the Achaean League, declined to join Antiochus, calculating that Roman protection offered greater security than alignment with a distant monarch. Roman response was swift and decisive. Viewing Seleucid intervention as a direct challenge to the post-Cynocephaly settlement, the Senate authorized military action. Roman forces, supported by allied contingents, advanced into central Greece. The first major engagement occurred at Thermopylae in 191 BCE. Although the site carried symbolic significance, the outcome reflected practical realities. Roman troops outflanked Seleucid positions using mountain paths, forcing Antiochus to retreat. The defeat shattered the credibility of Seleucid leadership in Greece. Following Thermopylae, Antiochus withdrew to Asia Minor. Roman forces pursued the conflict beyond Greece, determined to eliminate the Seleucid threat entirely. Naval operations, supported by Pergamene and Rhodian fleets, secured control of the Aegean. The decisive confrontation took place at Magnesia ad Sipylum in 190 BCE. Ancient accounts describe a large-scale battle in which Roman legions and allied forces overwhelmed the Seleucid army. The engagement demonstrated the limitations of Seleucid composite forces against coordinated Roman and allied operations. Archaeological evidence from Asia Minor supports the scale of disruption described in literary sources. Coin hoards and destruction layers correspond to the period of Roman advance, indicating widespread economic and administrative collapse within Seleucid territories. The defeat at Magnesia forced Antiochus into negotiations on Roman terms. The resulting Treaty of Apamea, concluded in 188 BCE, imposed severe restrictions on Seleucid power. Antiochus was required to relinquish all territories west of the Taurus Mountains, surrender much of his fleet, pay a substantial indemnity, and provide hostages, including his son. These terms permanently curtailed Seleucid influence in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. Control of Asia Minor passed largely to Roman allies, particularly Pergamon. For Greece, the consequences were immediate and lasting. The failure of Seleucid intervention discredited appeals to foreign monarchs as a viable strategy against Roman authority. The Aetolian League was punished severely, losing territory and political relevance. Rome emerged as the unchallenged arbiter of Greek affairs, with no rival power capable of contesting its decisions. Roman dominance now rested on a combination of military superiority and diplomatic enforcement. Greek states continued to retain internal autonomy, but their external relations were firmly constrained by Roman oversight. Appeals, treaties, and disputes increasingly flowed through Roman channels, reinforcing dependence on Roman judgment. By the end of the Roman-Syrian War, the geopolitical landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean had been fundamentally altered. Seleucid ambitions in Greece were extinguished, and Rome's authority extended from Italy to Asia Minor. Greek diplomacy now operated within a system defined by Roman power, setting the stage for growing resistance and deeper entanglement in Roman governance. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Macedonian kingdom remained formally intact but increasingly constrained by Roman oversight. Following the defeat of Philip V in the Second Macedonian War, Macedon was bound by treaties that limited its military capacity and diplomatic freedom. Despite these restrictions, the kingdom retained significant economic resources and a centralized administrative structure, allowing for gradual recovery under Philip's successor, Perseus. Perseus ascended the Macedonian throne in 179 BCE and immediately pursued internal consolidation. Ancient sources, including Polybius and Livy, describe reforms aimed at restoring fiscal stability and strengthening royal authority. Perseus reorganized taxation, reduced debt burdens, and rebuilt royal finances depleted by indemnities. He also cultivated relationships with Greek states disaffected by Roman intervention, presenting himself as a defender of traditional autonomy. These measures alarmed Roman officials. Although Perseus formally adhered to treaty obligations, his diplomatic outreach and financial recovery were perceived as threats to the balance of power established after Cynocephaly. Roman allies, particularly Pergamon, amplified these concerns. King Eumenes II accused Perseus of preparing for renewed conflict, claims recorded by Livy and debated within the Roman Senate. Tensions escalated throughout the 170s BCE. Roman diplomatic missions demanded assurances and concessions, while Perseus sought to delay confrontation through negotiation. Despite the absence of direct aggression, Rome interpreted Macedonian revitalization as incompatible with long-term stability. In 171 BCE, Rome declared war, initiating the Third Macedonian War. Early phases of the conflict were inconclusive. Roman forces encountered logistical difficulties in northern Greece, while Macedonian troops achieved limited successes through defensive positioning. Perseus relied heavily on the traditional phalanx and fortified terrain, avoiding open battle. This cautious strategy prolonged the war and strained Roman patience. The decisive phase unfolded in 168 BCE near Pydna in Macedonia. According to ancient accounts, including Polybius, the engagement began favorably for the Macedonian army. The phalanx initially pushed back Roman infantry on level ground. However, uneven terrain disrupted formation cohesion. Gaps emerged within the phalanx ranks, exposing vulnerable flanks. Roman legions exploited these weaknesses. Manipular units maneuvered into broken formations, engaging in close combat where Macedonian long spears were ineffective. The battle turned rapidly. Once formation integrity collapsed, Macedonian resistance disintegrated. Casualty figures reported by ancient sources indicate catastrophic losses, while Roman casualties remained comparatively low. Archaeological surveys of the Pydna region align with literary descriptions of intense combat and rapid collapse. The defeat marked the end of Macedonian military power. Perseus fled but was captured shortly thereafter and taken to Rome. His public display in a Roman triumph symbolized the definitive end of Macedonian kingship. Following the victory, Rome dismantled the Macedonian state. The kingdom was divided into 4 republics, each prohibited from intermarriage, shared governance, or unified military action. Royal lands were confiscated, and mineral exploitation was restricted. These measures, documented in senatorial decrees, were designed to prevent any resurgence of centralized authority. The dissolution of Macedon reshaped the political order of Greece. With the removal of the last major Hellenistic monarchy in the region, no power remained capable of challenging Roman decisions. Greek states lost any remaining leverage in diplomacy, becoming increasingly dependent on Roman arbitration. By the end of the Third Macedonian War, Rome had moved beyond indirect influence to structural reorganization. Macedonian independence was eliminated, and Roman authority became embedded in the political framework of the Eastern Mediterranean. From this point forward, resistance to Roman dominance would emerge not from rival kingdoms, but from within Greece itself. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the Achaean League stood at a critical juncture. Once regarded as the most cohesive and politically sophisticated of the Greek federations, it now faced mounting internal strain. The elimination of Macedonian power after 168 BCE removed the League's primary external rival, but it also exposed unresolved tensions within its own political structure. Roman authority, previously mediated through rival kingdoms, now confronted the League directly. The Achaean League had expanded significantly during the early 2nd century BCE, incorporating much of the Peloponnese, including Sparta after prolonged conflict. This expansion brought together cities with differing political traditions, economic interests, and social hierarchies. While federal institutions remained formally intact, cohesion weakened as local grievances increasingly shaped League-wide policy. Ancient sources, particularly Polybius, emphasized the growing divide between moderate leaders favoring cooperation with Rome and more radical factions advocating confrontation. Political discourse within the League shifted noticeably during the 150s BCE. Popular assemblies gained greater influence, often at the expense of experienced magistrates and diplomats. Demagogic figures rose to prominence by framing Roman arbitration as a threat to Greek autonomy. Anti-Roman rhetoric emphasized perceived humiliation, legal interference, and economic exploitation, resonating particularly among lower citizen classes affected by debt and land disputes. Roman involvement in Greek legal affairs intensified these tensions. The Senate increasingly intervened in disputes between Greek cities, including border conflicts and constitutional arrangements. In several cases, Roman decisions overrode League authority, undermining the credibility of federal institutions. Inscriptions and literary accounts indicate that Roman envoys were perceived less as neutral arbitrators and more as enforcers of Roman interests. The issue of Sparta proved especially destabilizing. Long-standing disputes between Sparta and the Achaean League prompted Roman intervention, culminating in Senate rulings that removed certain cities from League jurisdiction. These decisions weakened the League's territorial integrity and emboldened opposition factions. Moderates argued for compliance to preserve peace, while radicals interpreted Roman actions as deliberate efforts to dismantle Greek self-governance. Attempts at diplomatic restraint failed repeatedly. Roman embassies were dispatched to address grievances and discourage escalation. According to Polybius, these envoys urged moderation and warned of the consequences of defiance. However, their authority was undermined by the League's internal divisions. Radical leaders portrayed Roman warnings as intimidation, further inflaming public sentiment. By the late 150s BCE, political radicalization had become institutionalized. League assemblies increasingly rejected compromise, passing resolutions that challenged Roman authority. The execution or exile of pro-Roman officials reduced opportunities for negotiation. Decision-making processes grew reactive rather than strategic, driven by immediate popular pressures rather than long-term considerations. Economic factors reinforced this shift. War indemnities, disrupted trade, and competition with Roman commercial networks strained local economies. Discontented populations were more receptive to leaders promising restoration of autonomy through resistance. Although the League lacked the military capacity to challenge Rome, confidence persisted that collective action might deter direct intervention. Roman patience eroded as provocations accumulated. Senate debates, preserved indirectly through later historians, reveal frustration with Achaean intransigence. While Rome initially sought to avoid war in Greece, the breakdown of diplomatic channels limited alternatives. Each failed negotiation increased the likelihood of armed confrontation. By 146 BCE, the political environment within the Achaean League had shifted decisively. Factionalism replaced diplomacy as the dominant mode of governance. Anti-Roman radicalism, once confined to rhetoric, now shaped policy and mobilization. The League moved steadily toward conflict without a coherent military strategy or external allies. As moderation collapsed and escalation became irreversible, the final confrontation between Rome and the last major Greek federation drew closer. Radicalization within the Achaean League transformed internal dissent into open defiance, directly precipitating the war that would end Greek political independence in 146 BCE. The conflict between Rome and the Achaean League reached its decisive conclusion. Following months of diplomatic collapse and limited military engagements, Roman forces moved swiftly to suppress organized Greek resistance. Command of the campaign was entrusted to Lucius Mummius, a Roman consul with limited battlefield experience but full Senate authority. The confrontation that followed marked the final destruction of Corinth and the irreversible end of Greek political autonomy. The Achaean League entered the war at a severe disadvantage. Its forces consisted largely of citizen militias with limited training and coordination. Strategic planning was fragmented, and leadership was divided between ideological factions rather than unified command structures. Roman legions, by contrast, were professional, disciplined, and supported by allied contingents. Contemporary sources indicate that Rome's objective was no longer arbitration but enforcement. The decisive engagement occurred near Corinth itself. According to later Roman historians, Achaean forces attempted to block Roman advances along the isthmus. The battle was brief and one-sided. Roman manipular formations overwhelmed Greek lines through superior flexibility and command control. Once resistance collapsed, Corinth was left exposed. There was no prolonged siege or negotiated surrender. After capturing the city, Mummius ordered its systematic destruction. Ancient accounts describe widespread killing, enslavement of survivors, and the burning of civic and religious structures. Archaeological excavations at Corinth confirm a destruction layer dating to the mid-2nd century BCE, characterized by ash deposits, collapsed architecture, and abruptly abandoned domestic spaces. These findings align closely with literary testimony regarding the scale and suddenness of the sack. Roman actions at Corinth followed established practices for punitive warfare. Male inhabitants were killed, while women and children were sold into slavery. Public buildings, temples, and administrative centers were destroyed or looted. Notably, Roman sources emphasized the removal of artworks, bronzes, and statuary, many of which were transported to Rome and displayed in public spaces. This large-scale transfer of Greek art contributed to lasting cultural transformation within Roman society. The destruction of Corinth carried symbolic significance beyond its military outcome. Corinth was one of the wealthiest and most strategically located cities in Greece, controlling access between mainland Greece and the Peloponnese. By annihilating the city, Rome demonstrated that resistance would not be met with negotiation but eradication. The message was directed not only at Greece but at Rome's wider Mediterranean sphere. Interpretively, the sack of Corinth illustrates Rome's transition from hegemonic arbiter to imperial ruler. Earlier interventions in Greece had relied on treaties, client alliances, and diplomatic pressure. In 146 BCE, these mechanisms were abandoned in favor of direct coercion. The shift reflects a broader Roman reassessment of governance, prioritizing stability through deterrence rather than consensus. Another analytical insight lies in the choice of Corinth itself. Rome did not merely defeat the Achaean League militarily, it eliminated its administrative and economic center. This demonstrates an understanding of systemic power structures rather than symbolic kingship. By removing the League's core, Rome prevented future federative revival. Following Corinth's destruction, the remaining Greek cities offered no meaningful resistance. Roman authorities dissolved the Achaean League and imposed new administrative arrangements. While not yet organized as a formal province, Greece was placed under Roman oversight, with local autonomy severely restricted. Judicial authority increasingly rested with Roman magistrates, and foreign policy was removed entirely from Greek control. Inscriptions from the late 2nd century BCE reflect this transformation. Civic decrees emphasize loyalty to Rome and compliance with senatorial directives. Traditional federal institutions disappear from the epigraphic record, replaced by localized governance under Roman supervision. The language of autonomy persists symbolically, but its substance is absent. The long-term consequences of Corinth's destruction extended well beyond Greece. The event marked a turning point in Roman imperial policy, reinforcing the precedent that rebellion would result in annihilation rather than negotiation. It also accelerated cultural exchange, as Greek intellectuals, artisans, and artworks flowed into Italy through enslavement and appropriation. By the end of 146 BCE, Greek independence, already weakened by centuries of fragmentation, ceased to exist as a political reality. While cities retained cultural and religious significance, sovereignty was permanently lost. Roman authority was no longer indirect or conditional but absolute. Greece now entered a new administrative era, governed by Roman power and integrated into an expanding Mediterranean empire. Following the destruction of Corinth in 146 BCE, Rome did not immediately reorganize Greece into a formal province. Instead, Roman authorities adopted a system of indirect governance that reflected both pragmatism and restraint. The Senate assessed that direct provincial administration was unnecessary in a region already weakened by internal fragmentation and lacking the resources or unity to mount coordinated resistance. Greece was therefore placed under the broader authority of Roman-controlled Macedonia, while retaining limited internal autonomy at the civic level. Roman commissioners, commonly identified in sources as decemviri, were dispatched to oversee the post-war settlement. Their primary task was legal and constitutional reorganization rather than territorial annexation. Federal institutions such as the Achaean League were dissolved, and interstate political cooperation was prohibited. However, individual polis were allowed to retain their traditional civic structures, including councils, boule, assemblies, ecclesia, and annually elected magistrates. This arrangement preserved the outward forms of self-government while removing any capacity for independent foreign or military action. Epigraphic evidence from Athens, Delphi, and other central Greek cities confirms the continuity of civic life under Roman oversight. Honorific decrees, festival records, and public building inscriptions continued to be issued in Greek, employing long-established institutional language. At the same time, references to Roman officials and senatorial authority increasingly appear within these texts, indicating the limits of autonomy. Civic decisions required Roman approval when they touched on taxation, diplomacy, or judicial appeals. Rome's indirect rule relied heavily on cooperation with local elites. Wealthy landowners, magistrates, and priestly families served as intermediaries between their communities and Roman authorities. This elite collaboration reduced administrative burdens while stabilizing governance. In return, compliant cities were often granted favorable status, including reduced tribute obligations or recognition as civitates liberi, or free cities. Athens, for example, retained a privileged position due to its cultural prestige and long-standing diplomatic ties with Rome. Tribute arrangements varied significantly across Greece. Some cities were required to pay regular contributions to Roman-controlled Macedonia, while others were exempt or assessed irregularly. The absence of standardized taxation reflects the provisional nature of Roman rule during this period. Rather than imposing a uniform system, Rome responded to local conditions, balancing revenue extraction with political stability. Judicial authority also underwent significant restructuring. While local courts continued to adjudicate internal disputes, major cases, particularly those involving capital punishment, interstate conflicts, or Roman citizens, fell under Roman jurisdiction. Appeals could be directed to Roman magistrates in Macedonia or, in rare cases, to the Senate itself. This legal hierarchy reinforced Roman supremacy without dismantling Greek legal traditions entirely. Interpretively, this system demonstrates Rome's flexible approach to empire during the Mid-Republic. Rather than pursuing immediate territorial integration, Roman policymakers prioritized cost efficiency and risk management. Greece, devastated by war and lacking unified leadership, could be controlled through supervision rather than occupation. This approach also minimized the likelihood of rebellion by avoiding overt administrative disruption. A second analytical insight lies in the contrast between symbolic autonomy and practical subordination. Greek cities continued to function as cultural and religious centers, hosting festivals, maintaining temples, and producing philosophical scholarship. Yet these activities occurred within strict political constraints. Foreign policy was prohibited, military forces were disbanded, and any attempt at collective organization was suppressed. Autonomy existed in form but not in substance. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Public construction did not cease after 146 BCE, but large-scale fortification projects declined markedly. Defensive walls were repaired rather than expanded, and no new federal infrastructure emerged. The material record reflects a society adjusting to permanent external dominance rather than preparing for renewed conflict. For Rome, indirect rule also served a broader strategic function. Greece occupied a critical geographic position linking Italy to Asia Minor and the eastern Mediterranean. Maintaining stability without heavy garrisons ensured secure communication routes while allowing Roman forces to concentrate elsewhere. This was particularly important during Rome's ongoing conflicts in Spain and its increasing involvement in Asia. By the late 2nd century BCE, however, the limitations of indirect governance became increasingly apparent. Economic pressures, social inequality, and unresolved political tensions persisted within Greek cities. Roman supervision contained these issues but did not resolve them. As instability grew elsewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, Greece's subordinate yet strategically vital position would once again draw it into the center of Roman military and political affairs. By 88 BCE, the indirect system established after Corinth's destruction faced its greatest test. As external war and internal unrest converged across the region as Roman power consolidated in Greece after 146 BCE, control increasingly shifted from military enforcement to legal authority. Roman magistrates, provincial governors in Macedonia, and the Senate itself became central arbiters in Greek political, economic, and judicial affairs. Rather than governing through permanent garrisons, Rome embedded its dominance within legal processes that reshaped how Greek cities resolved disputes and exercised authority. Greek polis had long relied on arbitration, alliances, and interstate diplomacy to manage conflict. Under Roman oversight, these mechanisms were progressively displaced. Intercity disputes over territory, boundaries, and civic privileges were no longer negotiated through leagues or neutral sanctuaries. Instead, Greek communities petitioned Roman officials for binding judgments. Inscriptions from Delphi, Athens, and the Peloponnese preserve records of Roman decisions settling land claims and jurisdictional conflicts, often citing senatorial authority as final. Roman magistrates did not merely adjudicate disputes, they imposed precedents. Their rulings increasingly relied on Roman legal principles rather than Greek customary law. While local courts continued to function for internal civic matters, any case involving multiple cities, Roman interests, or economic significance could be escalated. Appeals to Rome became both common and expected. This process gradually reoriented Greek political culture toward external arbitration rather than autonomous resolution. The Roman Senate emerged as the supreme court of appeal. Greek embassies traveled regularly to Rome to plead cases involving taxation, debt relief, or civic status. Polybius and later writers note the frequency with which Greek delegations sought senatorial intervention. These appeals reinforced Rome's role not only as military hegemon but as the ultimate legal authority in the eastern Mediterranean. Taxation further institutionalized Roman control. Unlike later imperial systems, taxation in Greece during this period was inconsistent and negotiated. Some cities were required to pay tribute through Macedonian administration, while others were exempt due to historical alliances or strategic considerations. Athens, for example, benefited from exemptions reflecting its early cooperation and cultural significance. Other communities faced periodic levies rather than standardized annual taxation. Evidence from senatorial decrees indicates that fiscal obligations were often tied to political behavior. Cities that demonstrated loyalty or compliance received favorable treatment, while those suspected of unrest faced heavier burdens. This selective taxation system functioned as both incentive and deterrent, encouraging alignment with Roman interests without the need for direct coercion. Roman arbitration also extended into internal economic matters. Debt disputes, property confiscations, and inheritance conflicts increasingly fell under Roman review when instability threatened regional order. Greek elites, in particular, sought Roman backing to secure landholdings or political dominance within their cities. This reliance strengthened elite collaboration with Roman authorities, further embedding Roman influence within local governance structures. Interpretively, Rome's use of law as an instrument of rule reflects a strategic shift in imperial management. Rather than dismantling Greek institutions outright, Rome subordinated them within a broader legal hierarchy. Greek cities continued to operate, but their authority was conditional and revocable. Legal supremacy replaced overt occupation as the primary mechanism of control. A second analytical insight lies in the erosion of Greek diplomatic tradition. Sanctuaries such as Delphi had once served as neutral centers for arbitration and interstate negotiation. Under Roman dominance, their political role diminished. While religious activity continued, decision-making authority migrated to Roman magistrates and senatorial chambers. This transition marked a fundamental transformation in how power was exercised and legitimized. Archaeological and epigraphic records support this shift. Decrees increasingly reference Roman judgments, Latin terminology appears alongside Greek legal language, and civic honors are bestowed upon Roman officials rather than Greek benefactors. The material culture of governance reflects accommodation to Roman supremacy rather than resistance. Despite its effectiveness, legal oversight did not eliminate instability. Economic inequality persisted, local rivalries endured, and resentment toward Roman interference grew. Legal mechanisms could suppress open conflict, but they could not resolve the structural tensions inherited from decades of war and political fragmentation. By the late 2nd century BCE, Roman authority in Greece was firmly institutionalized through courts, taxation, and arbitration. Yet beneath this administrative order, conditions were forming that legal dominance alone could not contain, setting the stage for renewed upheaval in the eastern Mediterranean. By 88 BCE, Roman authority in Greece, though institutionally entrenched, faced its first significant existential challenge since the destruction of Corinth. Decades of indirect governance had produced stability, but economic pressures, social inequalities, and lingering resentment toward Roman interference created fertile conditions for external intervention. It was within this context that Mithridates VI of Pontus emerged as a formidable threat. Mithridates, ruler of the Pontic kingdom in northern Anatolia, sought to expand his influence across the eastern Mediterranean. He presented himself strategically as a liberator of Greek cities from what he characterized as Roman exploitation. Contemporary historians, including Appian and Plutarch, describe elaborate propaganda campaigns emphasizing his role as protector of Hellenic freedom. His envoys offered both financial incentives and military support to disaffected Greek polis, creating a network of client alliances that directly challenged Roman oversight. Athens proved the most significant among these collaborators. The city, with a history of civic pride and previous episodes of anti-Roman sentiment, received Mithridates' support for the expulsion of Roman officials and their allies. Archaeological strata from the period reveal extensive signs of disruption, including burned administrative buildings and hastily abandoned urban quarters, consistent with episodes of civil unrest or siege conditions. Inscriptions and contemporary accounts confirm the temporary installation of pro-Pontic magistrates and the removal of Roman-aligned councils. Other Greek cities, particularly in central and northern Greece, followed Athens' lead, aligning with Mithridates in anticipation of immediate military and political support. This alignment was motivated by both ideology and pragmatic considerations. Many communities sought to regain autonomy over taxation, judicial authority, and trade, while also expecting protection from Pontic forces against potential Roman reprisal. The escalation in Greece was mirrored by events in Asia Minor, where Mithridates orchestrated the systematic targeting of Roman citizens and their associates. Ancient sources report the massacre of tens of thousands of Italians in the coastal cities of Asia Minor, an act known historically as the Asiatic Vespers. Archaeological evidence, including mass graves and the abrupt cessation of civic activity in affected settlements, corroborates the intensity of the violence. These attacks provided Rome with both justification and urgency for military retaliation. Roman perception of these events emphasized both the severity of the threat and the necessity of rapid response. The Senate dispatched consular armies under Lucius Cornelius Sulla, tasking him with suppressing the rebellion and reasserting Roman authority throughout Greece and the eastern provinces. Roman preparations included mobilization of veteran legions and coordination with loyalist Greek allies who remained opposed to Pontic expansion. The political and military framework established decades earlier allowed Rome to project force efficiently despite initial surprise. Analytically, the Greek alignment with Mithridates demonstrates the limits of indirect Roman governance. Although law, taxation, and arbitration had institutionalized control, these mechanisms depended on elite cooperation and civic acquiescence. When both elites and urban populations perceived Rome as vulnerable or unjust, rebellion became feasible. The rapid spread of pro-Pontic sentiment underscores the fragility inherent in a system that relied on supervision rather than occupation. A second insight emerges in the interplay of ideology and opportunism. Mithridates' appeal to Greek autonomy leveraged historical memory of independence and previous conflicts with Macedon and Rome. At the same time, Greek cities acted pragmatically, aligning with a foreign power to protect economic interests and local authority. The convergence of ideological and strategic motives magnified the scale of resistance. By the summer of 88 BCE, the political landscape in Greece had shifted dramatically. Rome's absence of immediate military garrisons allowed Pontic influence to gain traction, creating the perception, however temporary, that Roman rule could be overturned. Civic institutions in rebel cities were reorganized under Pontic supervision, taxation was realigned to benefit local supporters, and Roman legal mechanisms were suspended or replaced. Despite this temporary ascendancy, the rebellion also set the stage for a decisive response. Rome's legions were experienced, disciplined, and strategically coordinated. The institutional framework of indirect governance, while vulnerable to sudden uprisings, provided a clear pathway for restoration of authority once Roman forces arrived. The events of 88 BCE thus illustrate both the latent instability in Greek cities and the enduring capacity of Rome to enforce compliance through military intervention. The brief alignment of Greek cities with Mithridates VI demonstrated that even decades of administrative control could be disrupted by strategic external intervention and popular discontent. However, the scale and severity of the Pontic campaign ensured that Rome would respond with overwhelming force, signaling that indirect rule alone could not withstand organized resistance. In 87 BCE, Roman response to Greek alignment with Mithridates VI reached its most visible and destructive phase. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, appointed to lead the Eastern legions, marched into Greece with the explicit objective of restoring Roman authority and punishing cities that had sided with the Pontic king. Among these, Athens became the principal target due to its historical prestige, active support for Mithridates, and symbolic importance as a center of Hellenic culture. Sulla's approach combined siege warfare with selective devastation. Ancient sources, including Plutarch and Appian, describe protracted operations lasting from 87 to 86 BCE. The Athenians fortified key positions, including the Piraeus harbor and the city's primary gates, attempting to resist superior Roman forces. Roman siege engines, artillery, and coordinated infantry assaults gradually overcame these defenses. Archaeological strata reveal widespread destruction of residential quarters, collapsed walls, and ash layers consistent with sustained siege conditions. Despite the severity of the attack, Sulla exercised a degree of selectivity in destruction. Civic and cultural landmarks, temples, theaters, and major public buildings were largely spared. Accounts note that the Parthenon, the Odeon of Pericles, and other key monuments survived, allowing Athens to retain its symbolic and cultural identity. This approach reflected Rome's broader strategic interest, punishing defiance without eliminating the city's role as a regional center. Casualties and displacement were significant. Contemporary sources describe mass deaths among combatants and non-combatants, as well as enslavement of surviving populations. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts, with mass graves and abandoned dwellings corresponding to the period. The destruction disrupted civic life, undermined local political institutions, and effectively ended Athens' capacity for independent military action. Roman legal and administrative authority was immediately reasserted. Following the siege, Sulla installed compliant magistrates, dissolved anti-Roman factions, and re-established tribute obligations. Inscriptions and decrees from the period reflect the imposition of Roman oversight, including judicial supervision, taxation enforcement, and limitations on civic decision-making. Athens remained formally autonomous in internal governance, but foreign policy and military autonomy were eliminated. The campaign had a broader impact across Greece. Neighboring cities observed the consequences of defiance and largely acquiesced to Roman authority. The siege demonstrated that Rome could employ overwhelming military force against even the most prestigious and historically significant cities. It reinforced the limitations of indirect governance. While legal oversight and diplomacy were effective under normal conditions, overt rebellion required decisive military intervention. Sulla's victory also reshaped perceptions of Rome in the eastern Mediterranean. The selective destruction of Athens sent a clear signal that punishment would be targeted and strategic, rather than indiscriminate, preserving structures of power while enforcing submission. Literary sources emphasize the psychological as well as material impact. The city's population was traumatized, and the memory of resistance served as a deterrent for other Greek communities. Interpretively, the siege illustrates the interplay between military power and administrative control. Roman authority relied on legal structures and local elites for day-to-day governance, but the capacity for decisive violence underpinned compliance. The experience of Athens demonstrates that even culturally central cities could be subordinated when indirect mechanisms proved insufficient. A second analytical insight concerns Rome's balancing of destruction and preservation. By sparing key monuments while devastating military and residential zones, Sulla maintained the symbolic significance of Athens for Greek culture. This preserved the city's utility as a cultural and political node under Roman supervision while eliminating its ability to act independently. Such measures reflect a calculated approach to empire building, combining coercion with strategic preservation. By the end of 86 BCE, Athens was firmly under Roman control. The siege and sack reaffirmed Rome's dominance in Greece, concluding the initial phase of the Mithridatic Wars in the region. Resistance had been punished decisively, and cities across Greece were reminded that rebellion carried both immediate destruction and long-term subordination. The campaign permanently altered Roman policy toward Greece. Whereas indirect administration had previously sufficed, Sulla's actions demonstrated that military force would be employed when legal authority failed. Greek cities were compelled to recognize the limits of autonomy and the consequences of aligning with external powers. From this point forward, Roman dominance was enforced through a calibrated combination of legal oversight, elite collaboration, and the credible threat of decisive military intervention. By the 1st century BCE, the integration of Greece into the Roman sphere extended beyond political and military domains into the realm of culture and education. Roman aristocrats, while consolidating control over the eastern Mediterranean, increasingly sought instruction in Greek literature, philosophy, and rhetoric. Greek cities, long centers of learning and intellectual activity, became vital hubs for this cultural transmission. Roman elites frequently traveled to Athens, Rhodes, and other Hellenic cities to study under established philosophers and rhetoricians. Schools of Stoicism, Epicureanism, and peripatetic philosophy attracted students eager to cultivate moral reasoning, political acumen, and eloquence. Figures such as Cicero explicitly acknowledged the formative influence of Greek tutors on Roman rhetorical and philosophical development. Similarly, Plutarch, writing in the early imperial period, records both Greek admiration for Roman patrons and the adoption of Greek intellectual frameworks by Roman elites. This cultural exchange was facilitated by the existing educational infrastructure of Greek cities. Gymnasia and philosophical schools provided structured curricula encompassing literature, mathematics, rhetoric, and ethics. Civic libraries and public lecture halls enabled the dissemination of texts and ideas. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and architectural remains, confirms the presence of foreign students in these centers and the continuation of public intellectual activity under Roman supervision. Greek educators often occupied privileged positions within Roman households, serving not merely as instructors but as advisors on political, ethical, and diplomatic matters. The reciprocal nature of these relationships reinforced social hierarchies while also transmitting Greek modes of thought into the administrative and legal practices of Roman governance. This interaction created a hybrid cultural elite capable of navigating both Roman political institutions and the broader Hellenic intellectual tradition. The impact of Greek education extended to public life. Roman magistrates and senators applied principles of rhetoric and civic reasoning learned in Greek schools to legislative debate, judicial proceedings, and diplomatic negotiation. Oratory, philosophical argumentation, and literary allusion became key instruments of influence in Roman political culture, demonstrating the practical utility of Greek intellectual training. Inscriptions and surviving texts indicate that knowledge of Greek language and literature became markers of elite status and competence. Interpretively, this dynamic illustrates a form of soft power that complemented Rome's military and administrative authority. Conquered Greece exercised influence over its conquerors by shaping the intellectual formation of Roman elites. The adoption of Greek educational practices reinforced cultural legitimacy for Rome while ensuring that political and legal decision-making could be informed by established Hellenic traditions. A second analytical insight concerns the creation of a trans-Mediterranean elite identity. Roman aristocrats trained in Greece were exposed to cosmopolitan ideas, historical narratives, and moral frameworks that transcended local Roman experience. This facilitated a broader understanding of empire, governance, and diplomacy, while simultaneously reinforcing social hierarchies that favored those with access to education abroad. Greek cities benefited materially and symbolically, as hosting Roman students enhanced prestige, attracted patronage, and sustained local educational institutions. Cultural reciprocity extended beyond philosophy and rhetoric. Roman patronage supported the maintenance of temples, theaters, and public monuments, while Greek art, sculpture, and literature entered the Roman sphere in unprecedented quantities. Wealthy Roman families commissioned Greek artists, collected Hellenic statuary, and integrated Greek cultural motifs into private and public architecture. This facilitated both aesthetic transmission and the reinforcement of Roman political ideology through cultural association with classical Greece. By the late Republic, the influence of Greek education had become institutionalized within Roman elite culture. Cicero's letters and treatises provide direct evidence of Greek philosophical engagement, while Plutarch's biographies illustrate the mutual respect and dependency between Roman patrons and Greek intellectuals. The intellectual formation acquired in Greek cities shaped the practices of governance, administration, and diplomacy that extended Rome's control across the Eastern Mediterranean. Ultimately, the adoption of Greek educational and philosophical frameworks reshaped Roman governance in subtle but profound ways. By incorporating Hellenic thought into law, rhetoric, and public administration, Roman elites created a synthesis that enhanced both practical capacity and cultural legitimacy. In this sense, Greece, though politically subordinated, exerted enduring influence over the structure and ideology of Roman authority. Following Rome's military and administrative consolidation of Greece, religious and cultural life demonstrated remarkable resilience. Temples, festivals, and civic cults continued to function, often under Roman supervision or sponsorship. The continuity of sacred practices provided both social cohesion and a framework for integrating Roman authority without eliminating local traditions. Temples remained central to civic and religious identity. Major sanctuaries, including the Acropolis in Athens and Delphi, continued to host annual festivals, processions, and sacrifices. Inscriptions and dedications from the period attest to continued offerings by local elites, with some evidence of Roman patronage or recognition. Roman authorities generally respected these institutions, understanding that their support reinforced stability and legitimized Roman governance. Artistic production likewise persisted. While large-scale artworks, bronzes, and statues were often transported to Rome, both as war spoils and as symbols of cultural prestige, local workshops continued to produce sculpture, pottery, and architectural decoration. Archaeological evidence from urban centers indicates uninterrupted craft activity, suggesting that economic and artistic networks remained operational despite political subordination. Roman collectors' interest in Greek art also provided new markets, incentivizing continued local production. Religious festivals functioned as both spiritual and civic instruments. Ritual calendars, including Pan-Hellenic games and local celebrations, were maintained with minimal interference. These events reinforced communal identity and civic hierarchy while offering opportunities for elite display and social negotiation. Roman officials occasionally participated in or sponsored these ceremonies, integrating themselves into local networks without displacing Greek authority entirely. Urban continuity extended beyond religious and artistic domains. Civic infrastructure, including marketplaces, theaters, and gymnasia, remained active. Public inscriptions indicate that municipal administration persisted, with magistrates, councils, and assemblies operating under the oversight of Roman authorities. Archaeological layers confirm ongoing occupation and maintenance of urban neighborhoods, reflecting adaptation rather than disruption. The combined persistence of religion, art, and urban institutions illustrates the pragmatic approach of Roman administration. Rome sought to secure political compliance while minimizing disruption to social and cultural systems. By allowing Greek traditions to continue, Roman authorities maintained legitimacy, reduced the risk of rebellion, and facilitated integration of conquered populations into the broader imperial framework. An analytical observation concerns the dual function of continuity and control. Sacred and artistic practices provided outlets for local identity, but they also reinforced the hierarchical order established by Rome. Public rituals, dedications, and civic displays operated within boundaries defined by external authority. In this sense, cultural life under Roman rule was both preserved and subordinated, offering stability without political independence. Another insight emerges from the economic dimension of cultural production. The movement of artworks to Rome stimulated patronage networks and maintained urban craft industries in Greece. Local elites benefited from commissions, trade, and prestige, while Roman consumption of Greek culture reinforced imperial ideology. Archaeological evidence, including coins, workshops, and inscriptions, supports the persistence of productive activity alongside large-scale appropriation. By maintaining religious, artistic, and urban continuity, Greece achieved a degree of cultural stability that complemented Rome's administrative objectives. Sacred traditions and civic institutions functioned as stabilizing forces, mediating between local communities and imperial authority. This continuity ensured that cities remained centers of social and economic activity, facilitating integration into the Roman world without immediate cultural disruption. By the end of this period, the Greek urban and religious landscape had adapted to Roman oversight. Temples, festivals, art, and civic infrastructure persisted, creating a durable foundation for civic life under imperial rule. Cultural stability, achieved through a combination of local initiative and Roman supervision, contributed to long-term peace, enabling Rome to consolidate its authority while preserving the Hellenic identity that continued to influence the broader Mediterranean world. By the 1st century BCE, Greece had long ceased to operate as an independent political entity. Its cities retained cultural and religious significance, but strategic control rested firmly in Roman hands. This position made Greek territories particularly important during periods of internal Roman conflict. During the civil wars that characterized the late Republic, Greece became both a staging ground and a contested arena for competing Roman factions. The first major involvement occurred during the civil war between Pompey and Julius Caesar, 49 to 45 BCE. Greek ports and cities provided logistical support, recruitment grounds, and financial resources. According to contemporary accounts, Pompey relied on Corinth, Epirus, and Thessaly for provisioning and troop movements, while Caesar sought local cooperation for safe passage into the eastern provinces. The allegiance of Greek communities was largely determined by proximity, prior treaties, and pragmatic considerations rather than ideology. Inscriptions and municipal records reveal payments, hostings of troops, and requisitions imposed on urban centers during these campaigns. Greek cities faced limited autonomy in these circumstances. Their territories were used to supply armies, levy contributions, and provide shelter for displaced populations. Although some local elites attempted to navigate loyalties to maintain civic stability, the overwhelming military presence of Roman commanders dictated compliance. Archaeological evidence, including hastily constructed fortifications, temporary encampments, and destruction layers in urban areas, reflects the physical impact of these campaigns on the landscape. The Eastern Greek world saw repeated disruptions during subsequent conflicts. During the power struggle following Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Mark Antony operated extensively in Greece, utilizing Thessaly and Macedonia as bases for army recruitment and naval preparation. Athens and Corinth again played logistical roles, hosting troops and acting as collection points for supplies. Local governance was subordinated to the strategic imperatives of Roman generals, leaving civic institutions with little capacity to act independently. Economic and social consequences accompanied military occupation. Grain requisitioning, forced contributions, and billeting of soldiers placed substantial burdens on urban and rural communities. Civic revenues were diverted to support military needs, and trade networks experienced temporary disruption. Evidence from coin hoards, inscriptions, and administrative records shows increased taxation and extraordinary levies associated with the movement and quartering of armies. Despite these pressures, Greek cities retained elements of continuity in civic, religious, and cultural life. Temples, festivals, and educational institutions continued to operate, providing local elites with mechanisms for social cohesion and prestige, even under external military control. The duality of disruption and continuity illustrates how Roman civil conflicts impacted Greece without fundamentally dismantling its cultural infrastructure. Analytically, the civil wars reveal the strategic value of Greek territories to Roman actors. Their geography, resources, and port networks made them indispensable for military campaigns. At the same time, the repeated occupation exposed the vulnerabilities of indirect governance. Cities nominally autonomous under Roman law could not resist the demands of competing generals, demonstrating that political and military authority remained inseparable in practice. A second insight concerns the interaction between Greek civic structures and Roman military needs. Local councils and elites often negotiated with commanders to mitigate burdens, coordinate provisioning, and protect cultural institutions. These arrangements allowed some continuity of civic function even amid widespread military activity, underscoring the adaptability of urban governance under external pressure. By the conclusion of the late Republican civil wars, Greece had been repeatedly drawn into the machinations of Roman power. Neutrality was no longer an option, and the cumulative impact of occupation, requisitioning, and military engagement accelerated changes in administration. The political independence of Greek cities was effectively nullified, while their role as logistical and strategic assets for Roman generals became entrenched. These experiences laid the groundwork for structural reorganization under the early empire. Repeated military use of Greek territories demonstrated the need for more direct oversight, better coordination of taxation and resources, and integration into broader imperial networks. Civil war thus served as a catalyst, transforming Greek governance from indirect supervision into a system increasingly oriented toward imperial efficiency and control. In 27 BCE, following the consolidation of power under Augustus, Greece was formally reorganized as the senatorial province of Achaia. Although Rome had exercised indirect control for over a century, this administrative reform marked the first time Greek territories were fully integrated into the imperial provincial system. Corinth, long a major urban and strategic center, was designated the provincial capital, establishing a central locus for governance, taxation, and judicial oversight. The creation of the province of Achaia formalized previously provisional arrangements. Augustus appointed a proconsular governor to oversee the region, accountable to the Senate rather than the emperor directly. This placement reflected the province's status as relatively peaceful and strategically non-critical, allowing Rome to delegate authority while maintaining ultimate oversight. Governors supervised taxation, maintained order, adjudicated major legal disputes, and ensured compliance with imperial decrees. Administrative structures were standardized across the province. Local city councils, boule, and magistrates were maintained but subordinated to the governor's authority. Tribute obligations were codified, with regular assessments replacing the irregular levies and contributions of the mid-republic. Civic responsibilities, including the maintenance of temples, public buildings, and infrastructure, were retained but closely monitored. Inscriptions from Corinth and Athens document both the appointment of officials and the recording of civic revenues, reflecting the integration of traditional Greek governance within a formal Roman bureaucratic framework. Judicial authority was centralized under the provincial governor. Appeals from local courts could be escalated to the proconsul, who acted in accordance with Roman law and precedent. In practice, this institutionalized a hierarchy in which local autonomy was circumscribed but civic structures remained intact. Greek cities were permitted to conduct internal administration, regulate markets, and manage festivals, yet ultimate authority resided with Rome, ensuring uniform compliance with imperial standards. The establishment of Achaea also reinforced economic and strategic integration. Corinth's position as a nexus between mainland Greece and the Peloponnese facilitated the collection of tribute, regulation of maritime trade, and deployment of limited garrisons when necessary. The province became a hub for regional administration, supporting broader imperial objectives in the eastern Mediterranean. Road networks, harbors, and civic infrastructure were maintained and, in some cases, upgraded to accommodate provincial governance. Cultural and civic life continued alongside these administrative reforms. Greek cities maintained religious, educational, and artistic institutions. Inscriptions, civic dedications, and festival records demonstrate the coexistence of Roman authority with local cultural traditions. This integration reflects Rome's continued strategy of leveraging existing institutions for stability while embedding imperial power within formal structures. Analytically, the formalization of Achaea illustrates the transition from indirect supervision to full provincial administration. Previous arrangements had relied on elite cooperation and legal oversight. The senatorial province codified these relationships into a permanent, bureaucratically monitored system. It also demonstrates the Roman capacity to balance control with continuity, preserving Greek civic identity while enforcing political and fiscal subordination. A second observation concerns the symbolic and practical significance of Corinth. As the provincial capital, it embodied both continuity and transformation. Corinth had previously served as a major cultural, economic, and military center. Under Augustus, it also became the seat of imperial administration. The city's dual role reinforced Roman authority while maintaining the urban and civic functions essential to local society. By the end of Augustus' reforms, the province of Achaea had achieved stability. Administrative hierarchies were clearly defined, fiscal systems standardized, and legal authority centralized. Greek cities adapted to this framework, functioning under Roman oversight while preserving aspects of local governance, culture, and identity. The formal establishment of Achaea marked the final institutionalization of Roman control, transforming centuries of intermittent supervision, military intervention, and indirect rule into a permanent provincial reality. The creation of the province laid the groundwork for subsequent imperial governance. With Achaea's political structure stabilized, Roman authorities could focus on integration, economic exploitation, and cultural patronage, setting the stage for nearly 5 centuries of Roman administration in Greece. The Roman conquest of Greece established institutional frameworks whose influence extended far beyond the collapse of the Republic and the early empire. Political structures introduced under Roman governance, legal hierarchies, provincial administration, and civic oversight reshaped the operation of Greek cities and ultimately informed governance models in the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The impact of these frameworks persisted into the Byzantine period, demonstrating the long-term durability of Roman administrative innovation. Roman law formed the backbone of this transformation. Civic, provincial, and imperial legal mechanisms were codified and applied across Greek territories. Governors, magistrates, and senatorial courts exercised authority through a standardized legal hierarchy, replacing fragmented or customary systems that had governed Greek city-states for centuries. Appeals could be made to the proconsul or the Senate, and local courts were subordinated to Roman law in matters affecting imperial interest. Inscriptions, senatorial decrees, and municipal records attest to the systematic application of these frameworks, illustrating a shift from local autonomy to structured oversight. Provincial administration also institutionalized the balance between central authority and municipal function. Cities retained internal councils, assemblies, and magistracies, but their authority was circumscribed by Roman oversight. Tribute obligations, judicial review, and the deployment of governors ensured that local power operated within a clearly defined imperial framework. These mechanisms created a predictable hierarchy in which civic activity continued, yet ultimate sovereignty rested with Rome. The codification of these practices provided a model that later Byzantine administrators could adapt for provincial governance, demonstrating continuity across political transitions. The Roman approach to fiscal and administrative management reinforced institutional resilience. Taxation, resource allocation, and judicial adjudication were standardized over time, reducing dependence on ad hoc arrangements. Civic elites were integrated into the administrative network, ensuring compliance and facilitating local governance. Epigraphic evidence, including decrees honoring proconsuls and records of tax collection, reflects the operational sophistication of these systems. The integration of Greek cities into a provincial framework provided both stability and long-term administrative continuity, establishing patterns that would outlast the empire itself. Strategic urban organization further reinforced political legacy. Capitals such as Corinth, administrative centers in Macedonia, and provincial hubs in the Peloponnese were equipped with public infrastructure designed to accommodate Roman oversight. Roads, harbors, forums, and civic buildings facilitated the enforcement of law, the collection of tribute, and the coordination of military and civil administration. These urban networks persisted as functional nodes into the Byzantine period, demonstrating the enduring influence of Roman planning and governance. Interpretively, the Roman political legacy in Greece illustrates the capacity of imperial systems to produce enduring institutional frameworks. While military conquest provided immediate control, it was the codified administrative structures that ensured long-term stability and integration. Greek civic institutions were adapted rather than eradicated, allowing continuity of local culture and municipal function within an overarching imperial hierarchy. This duality between local autonomy and central authority became a hallmark of Eastern Mediterranean governance for centuries. A second analytical observation concerns the transmission of governance models. Byzantine administrators inherited Roman provincial practices, legal structures, and fiscal mechanisms, adapting them to changing political and religious contexts. The alignment of civic councils, proconsular oversight, and hierarchical legal authority established under Roman rule provided the structural foundation upon which Byzantine provinces operated. In this sense, the conquest of Greece created both immediate political subordination and enduring institutional templates. By the end of the early imperial period, Roman legal and administrative frameworks had become fully embedded in Greek society. Civic, fiscal, and judicial practices reflected a synthesis of Hellenic traditions and Roman structures, producing a durable system capable of surviving regime change. These mechanisms ensured continuity in urban management, taxation, and legal adjudication, providing the institutional stability necessary for both local and imperial objectives. Ultimately, the political and institutional legacy of the Roman conquest demonstrates that empires extend their influence not only through armies but through governance. While Greek military independence ended with Rome's intervention, the structures established during conquest persisted across centuries. The durability of these institutions illustrates how administrative innovation can outlast the empire itself, influencing subsequent political and bureaucratic systems, including those of the Byzantine world. The institutional consolidation achieved under Roman rule provided the framework for both stability and integration. Legal hierarchies, provincial oversight, and municipal cooperation created a predictable and enduring administrative environment. Political authority, once fragmented among independent polis, was centralized under an overarching imperial structure, ensuring continuity even amid cultural and dynastic transitions. These frameworks would define the organization of the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, ensuring that the legacy of Roman governance in Greece extended well beyond the immediate military conquest. If you found this journey through Greece under Roman rule enlightening, subscribe to Nightfall History for daily deep dives into the civilizations that shaped our world. Click the bell icon to never miss a video, and share your thoughts in the comments. What moment in Greece's transformation under Rome surprised you the most?